Have you heard what's happening in Calgary, Canada? Home to some of the world's best researchers and innovators in life sciences, Calgary is advancing healthcare solutions to solve global challenges. Calgary's dedication to the life sciences sector is evident in its labs, hospitals, schools, and the minds of its people, with its top institutions producing internationally recognized research and more than 110 life science companies backed by a highly skilled pool of talent. The life sciences sector is accelerating innovation in Calgary. If you're a bright mind or a bright company, Calgary is just the place for you. Take a closer look at calgarylifesciences.com. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. As 2021 fades into the history books, it'll be remembered as one with exuberant IPOs, punishing aftermarkets, and a lingering pandemic that once again is turning the annual JPMorgan Healthcare Conference into a virtual event. We continue our annual tradition of sitting down with Stat senior writer Adam Feuerstein to discuss the year that was in biotech, the best and worst CEOs of 2021, and what's ahead in the new year. Adam, thanks for joining us.
Danny, it's always good to be here. This is like our regular year-end thing.
It is. It wouldn't be Christmas without sitting down to chat.
That's right.
Talk about the year past and the year ahead.
Yep.
The pandemic is raging and JPMorgan is going virtual. I think we should be clear that we're recording this at the end of 2021, not 2020.
I know, it's like deja vu, isn't it?
Boatloads of money going into biotech this year, and yet the major biotech indices are down sharply from their highs. What kind of a year will 2021 be remembered as for biotech?
I guess it depends on your perspective, right? I mean, if you're an investor in publicly traded biotech companies, it's probably a year you want to forget, except maybe if all you owned is some penny stocks or COVID related stocks seem to do okay.
They didn't start,
but everything else did awful. So from that perspective, it was a bad year. I mean, from kind of a industry wise, if you kind of step away from the investment side, I guess it was an okay year. I don't think it was like a year that will stand out in anyone's mind. But it was there was maybe some steady progress on various projects.
You broke from tradition this year and said you were not naming a worse biopharma CEO for 2021, but instead named 10. Why is that?
Because it was just a good year for bad CEOs. It's like why pick one when you can pick 10?
We're not going to run through the list, but I did want to talk about the one CEO who made the list who's a non-biopharma CEO. That's Cathie Wood, founder, CEO, and CIO of ARK Investment. Why Wood?
Yeah, I was trying to think of a way that I wanted to sort of encapsulate some of the things I think that were bad or detrimental to the sector this year. And, and I have nothing against Cathie Wood, except that, I think that sort of her style in investing and particularly what she did in kind of actually starting in late 2020, sort of the fall of 2020 and going into early 2021 in terms of, just huge amounts of, billions of dollars of inflows into her funds. And she was buying up a lot of those CRISPR genome editing companies, so CRISPR Therapeutics, Beam, Editas, et cetera. And, so the stocks were going up. These are not, it's interesting, right? She's known as a tech investor. But, when you pour a bunch of money into Google or Tesla or Apple, it's a little bit different than if you pour billions of dollars into these genome editing stocks because, they're just smaller companies. And what we saw was basically it just created this kind of genome editing bubble in the beginning of the year, where the valuations of those companies got really out of whack with their progress, in terms of the clinical development of their treatments. And so, if you look at those stocks, particularly in sort of January and February of this year, they just really rose and then kind of crashed. Right, bubbles tend to crash, and so that's what happened. And I think that sort of that definitely contributed to a lot of the underperformance, for the entire year. And so it seemed fitting to put her on the worst biopharma CEO list, even though she's not a biopharma CEO.
I think paired with Wood is the Wall Street IPO bankers. We've seen a flood of new issues. You don't normally like to talk about IPOs, but what happened here this year?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of IPOs, and there were a lot of, particularly of IPOs of companies that were still in the preclinical stages. So these are companies still testing things in test tubes and labs and mice and monkeys and et cetera, right? Really, really super early stage companies going public. And I think there was just a flood of those. And what you saw was a lot of companies just seemed to they would make their debut on Wall Street, and the stocks would just get sort of flipped around, and there was not a lot of fundamental support for these companies. There wasn't a lot of people who sort of wanting to buy them for the long term. So, I mean, what's incredible this year, I think it's something like 70% of the IPOs this year are trading below their offering price.
Well,
it's a phenomenal statistic if you think about it. Just how many of these, just are essentially broken IPOs.
We've seen this appetite for preclinical companies in the IPO market for a few years now, but there was a time you could not get an IPO without a product, or at least a very late stage phase 3 that was pretty confident of getting a product to market. What do you think the longer term consequence of that's going to be?
Well, I would hope that one of the consequences is these companies stop going public. This is not like you said, this is not a 2021 phenomenon. It really sort of started picking up in 2020, and then continued into 2021. So then, if you look at just sort of the last 2 years, there's just a sharp increase in the number of companies, preclinical biotech companies, going public. If you compared that to 2019, 2018, I would hope that the underperformance of those companies and the lessons learned from that, the painful lessons learned, would kind of stop some of those companies. I mean, look, there's always going to be some companies that are preclinical that are going to go public, but I just think that it just doesn't serve anyone's purpose. There's a ton of money still flooding into biotech, even on the private side, right? So maybe these companies should sort of mature a little bit before they IPO. And I think you probably will end up seeing that, because I think what do we call it? The IPO window, right? Everyone likes to use the window analogy. I think the window is kind of shut, or is only open to crack at this point, because the pace of IPOs has certainly slowed down.
Well, the best biopharma CEO went to Albert Bourla of Pfizer. As a follow-up to their COVID vaccine success, we saw the development of Paxlovid, which just got approved. This is its treatment for COVID-infected patients. What do you think is most impressive about his performance this year?
I think it's just really execution. Just the ability. If we think back a year ago, we're recording this to December 23rd, 2021. If you think just exactly a year ago, literally remember the vaccines had just been, had just received their conditional approvals, right? They just gotten their EUAs. And so we were just watching kind of the initial rollout of the vaccines. And to sort of fast forward 12 months to think, how many billions of doses have been produced, put into people's arms. And then on top of that, to develop, really what is a very effective oral antiviral, pill to treat COVID infection. That's a pretty amazing, those are two pretty amazing accomplishments if you think about it. And then, Pfizer had a great year. Their stock, from an investment standpoint, their stock obviously did great this year. So, it was not hard to pick him as the best biopharma CEO of 2021.
As I think back on the biggest stories of the year, at the top has got to be Aduhelm, the Biogen Alzheimer's drug that won controversial accelerated approval despite the objections of an FDA advisory panel and lack of evidence of its efficacy. What's the market had to say about the drug now that it's been available?
Well, yeah, I spent a lot of time this year writing about Biogen, writing about Aduhelm. I feel like that's all I did in 2021 is to cover. We at Stat we definitely, it was this was a sort of a plan that we had, and we knew that it was a big story coming into this year. Coming into June when we knew that the FDA decision was going to be handed down. I mean, we thought about this, like this was a really, in terms of non-COVID stories, it was probably the biggest non-COVID story in biotech this year. I mean, just because of the implications and the need for Alzheimer's treatments. And so we knew that we were going to devote a lot of time and resources to reporting out that story. And we didn't necessarily know where the story was going to go, what directions we were going to go into when the FDA decided to approve Aduhelm. But yeah, we spent a lot of time, and so it's been a fascinating story. And as we sort of exit the year, where do we find Biogen? We find Biogen cutting the price of Aduhelm in half. That is obviously out of not something that they want to do, but the drug is certainly not selling as well as they had hoped. I mean, it's generating a fraction of the revenue that they had expected. It's forced the company to, as we've reported and as they've now kind of announced themselves, it's forced the company to restructure. I mean, they're looking to cut costs, and that's including layoffs of employees that is trying to save about $500 million in the next year. And so they're kind of at a crossroads. Now we have a very important Medicare reimbursement decision coming up. Actually, just in a few weeks, on January 12th, we'll get a preliminary view of how CMS is going to handle reimbursement for Aduhelm, and that will be an important inflection point to see where the drug goes. But yeah, so it's been a fascinating story, and we've written a lot about the sort of inner turmoil and dysfunction within Biogen that has resulted from all of this Aduhelm stuff.
Do you think there's lasting blowback at the FDA over this?
That's a good question. I don't know how to answer it, but I think we may have some idea later on in 2022. Because there'll be at least one, maybe two, amyloid, anti-amyloid antibody drugs, going up under review at the FDA. We've got Lilly's donanemab. Probably will be the first one. And then, Biogen and Eisai, their Japanese pharma partner, are going to bring lecanemab, their other, sort of version 2.0. They're going to bring that in front of the FDA too. So we'll see how the FDA reviews those and whether they take a more conservative stance or whether sort of the Aduhelm approval set this precedent. And that's the precedent that they'll follow. So I think that'll be really interesting to see both how, what the FDA does and then sort of how the market accepts those drugs.
Joe Biden has picked former FDA Chairman Robert Califf as his choice to once again lead the FDA. He's a cardiologist by training. He's got strong ties to pharma. During his confirmation hearings, he told Bernie Sanders that drug prices are way too high in this country. I'm not sure how meaningful that is since the FDA doesn't regulate drug pricing, but what do you think Califf will mean for the industry?
I think it's probably business as usual. I think he's somebody who, he's been an academic. He's an academic scientist. He's been in industry before. So I think it's somebody that biopharma is a known quantity, I guess I would put it. And so someone that they're probably comfortable with. The FDA faces a lot of challenges. I mean, it's been rough. It's kind of been rough sledding, and with COVID and everything, we know why. So, I don't know if there's going to be any sort of major changes under Califf. I don't see him as sort of like some kind of like bomb thrower necessarily. I don't think anybody sort of anticipates that.
The jury is deliberating in the Elizabeth Holmes case. The Theranos founder is accused of fraud. I can't remember, but I'm guessing she may have made your list of worst CEOs when you're.
I think way back, yeah.
As you think about the money going into biotech today, are there lessons investors should take from the Holmes case?
Well, I think one of the interesting takeaways from Theranos, and this is not new. I mean, this is going back to when everything there blew up, was just like how gullible a lot of investors were. And sort of believing the Theranos story without actually getting any sort of definitive proof, right, of what the machine could do. So we'll see. It's interesting, right? They're deliberating the case now. It's at the jury right now. So I haven't necessarily followed every twist and turn of the trial, but it's certainly the verdict should come down in any day.
Well, as I look back on your coverage over the past year in terms of technology, the one word that seemed to crop up again and again was CRISPR. What excites you from a technology point of view? Would it be CRISPR? Would it be something else that's on the horizon that you think might be transformative?
Well, I put John Leonard, who's the CEO of Intellia Therapeutics. He was on my best CEO list. Like, he was sort of a finalist. And the reason I put him, I like to try to put a scientist or a sciencey type person on that list. And he made it this year because of, Intellia was the first company to show in vivo genome editing, right? So they actually edited the DNA of these, edited DNA inside the body. Before all this, what happened, what was done is either the cells are taken out, the editing is done in the lab, put back in the patient, or it's done locally, like in the eye, or it's just someplace where it could be reached that way. So it's kind of a pretty milestone achievement to be able to show that you can actually edit the cells inside the body. And that was one of the bigger scientific advances of 2021. So, and I think it points to a really interesting future because of diseases that you can reach and things that you can do with it. And there's all kinds of different, there's all these different, I call them flavors of CRISPR or genome editing that are right now kind of undergoing, still very early, right? Still in the labs, still being tested in animals. But I think what we'll see next year is we'll start to see some of those data in people, in patients. And so I think right now, a lot of people think of CRISPR, and to some extent I do too, just think of it as kind of this monolithic technology. But there are a lot of different ways to go about the genome editing, and we'll start to see the advantages and disadvantages of each of these different technologies within kind of the broader genome editing or CRISPR umbrella.
As I mentioned at the top, JPMorgan's going virtual once again this year because of COVID concerns. Do you think there's risk to 2 years in a row that the event will lose some of its power and allure going forward?
I do. I personally was going this year. And we had definitely at Stat, we had decided that we were stepping back because we didn't think it was going to be as big of a year, even if it did happen in person, because of all the COVID risks and everything. And so we were only sending a single person, and so that person was me. And usually we'll have like a whole team of people go out. Maybe there'll be, but maybe Danny, maybe there'll be like some sort of like blowback, like it'll be like a rebound. Maybe in 2022 or 2023, that if it is in person, like after 2 years being virtual, like so many people will want to go that it'll be like the biggest year ever.
Well,
that could happen.
You've been through this once as a virtual event. Do you approach coverage of the event differently as a virtual event?
Well, I think you have to, right? Because it's so much of what makes it a unique experience is just kind of being on the ground and running into people or kind of being at a party and hearing things. And it's the same thing that you hear about virtual medical meetings, right? Like you can cover the presentations and you can cover like, whether it's at a medical meeting or an investment meeting like JPMorgan, like, you can log in to your computer, you get on the Zoom or whatever, and you can watch it and report what's going on. but it sort of loses something in that virtual world, right? Because you're not in the room, you're not getting a reaction, sort of this visceral reaction from people. You're not running into people. You're not just like hearing the gossip that people are talking about, whether it's at a party or somewhere in a room or in a hallway. So I think it lacks that, and that makes it less exciting to cover. But companies still have to put out their news, and companies still have to let people know kind of what their plans are for the year ahead. So a lot of that stuff just kind of goes on, whether that happens virtually or whether we do it in person. That sort of machinery of kind of just setting the tone, setting an agenda for the next 12 months will still happen regardless of the format.
Oh, what will you be watching at this year's JPMorgan and beyond?
Well, I'll be watching my computer screen. And I'll probably be doing it from my house because our office is, we're still not back to the office, and now it's probably delayed even longer because of Omicron. But I think, just again, I like what I probably do every year is just I like to hear how CEOs tell the story of the company that they run, and think about what they've said in the past and how the stories changes and how priorities change. What drugs are they talking up? What drugs are maybe they're talking down or maybe not talking as much about? So all those kinds of things that you sort of pick up on, you try to pick up on, is what I'll be looking for. And then, hopefully there's like a good bit of news. I mean, it's always a nice when you get up on that Monday morning of JPMorgan and there's some big deals happening or something that you can write about. So we'll hope for that.
Beyond JPMorgan, what are you going to be watching in 2022?
I have to think about that. I haven't even written my 2022 preview yet, so I need to do that. Well, we mentioned the Alzheimer's stuff, so certainly that will carry over from this year. And we'll, not only kind of how Biogen handles Aduhelm, but again, these other Alzheimer's drugs and what happens to them. I think that will be a big story. Gene therapy. You mentioned the gene therapy stuff. I think as it evolves, it's not been a great year. Maybe it's not been a great 2 years for gene therapy. There have been questions, safety issues that have come up, particularly with sort of the viral delivery of gene therapy, and even on the manufacturing side, there have been some delays and hiccups on the manufacturing side. So I think it's a year where you want to sort of see some of maybe the less glamorous sides of gene therapy. Kind of see, again, on the manufacturing, it's not something that we talk about a lot, but it's certainly important. And see whether some of the stuff can be figured out. And, I think the biggest question with gene therapy is just whether or not these can be successful commercial products. We've seen setbacks there, particularly in Europe. Now, the U.S. should be a little bit more permissive in terms of pricing and reimbursement, but we really need to see, if you think about gene therapy, just still relatively only just a handful of them on the market. And so we don't really know what that business model is going to look like. So I think that's one thing that I will certainly be looking out for.
Adam Feuerstein, senior writer for Stat News. Adam, thanks as always.
Thanks for having me, Danny.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.